Good, so let me start. So as I said, I'm Ken Stern. I'm the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. Thank you for attending the webinar today with Mengyao Lee. It's my pleasure to invite her, to speak with you, and you'll have a great pleasure listening to her as well. She's the Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute on Research and Collective Goods in Bonn, Germany. And before moving to Germany, she got her PhD in social psychology from the Peace and Violence program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And before that, I'm proud to say a joint BA degree in psychology and human rights from Bard College in 2012. So she's been out of college for less than 12 years and has accomplished more than so many people that have been decades out from college. So that's another reason I'm proud to have her. Her research lies at the intersection of social, political, and peace psychology, and broadly focuses on the psychological processes of intergroup conflicts and their resolution, group-based violence, national and ethnic identity, transitional justice and civil resistance and social change. And today she's going to be speaking to us about a book chapter called Understanding Intergroup Violence and its Aftermath from Perpetrator and Victim Perspectives. And I have to say, I first encountered Mengyao when I was asked to be the moderator of a plenary session at the Gonzaga Institute for Hate Studies International Conference in the fall. And the other people on the plenary were people that I knew of, people like Robert Sapolsky and Thomas Brutholm, who's a philosopher, and Kathleen Blee, who couldn't attend that day because she was actually testifying or preparing to testify at the Charlottesville case. But I had not heard of Mengyao Lee, and I, of course, went to Dr. Google and was so pleased to see again that she was a Bard alum. She studied with two of my closest colleagues, Kristen Lane, who I believe is on the webinar today, and Tom Keenan, who directs the Human Rights Project, who unfortunately has a meeting and asked me to apologize for you, but he'll see the tape of it. And I have to say, when I started looking at Menyao's work, I went back to her senior project, BARD. For those of you who don't know BARD, students have to do a senior project to graduate. And what impressed me about it the most, and I see this in the other articles she's written, is she's really the definition of what you want in terms of an academic who looks at data, interprets it. She wasn't afraid in her senior project when she had a particular thesis and it didn't work out exactly the way that you could tell that she had hoped at the beginning. She actually embraced where the direction of her research went rather than seemingly disappointed. And I thought that was just a marvelous instructional way for people to look at critical thinking and writing about anything. So without further ado, I'm going to let Mengyao speak. She's going to speak for about a half hour or so, give or take. And I invite you to put in questions and answers in the Q&A box as she's speaking. If you want, I'll remind you again at the end of her presentation, then we'll have a discussion and finish at the top of the hour. So Mengyao, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ken, for the introduction. And thank you so much for having me here today. Hope you can all see my slides fine. It's really great to be back at BARDS, even if it's only virtually. And I want to start out by saying how delighted I was to learn about the Center for Hate Studies. BARD was really the place where I first got interested in the interdisciplinary work on hate and intergroup violence. And that's also why I did a joint senior project in psychology and human rights under the mentorship of Kristen and Tom. And so it's a really great pleasure to be here and talk to you about the psychological perspective on intergroup violence and share some of the work that I've been doing over the past years. So what I'll be talking about is mainly based on our chapter in this book that came out in 2019. It's called Confronting Humanity at its Worst, And as the title suggests, it offers a social psychological perspective on genocide and other forms of mass atrocities. And some of the big questions addressed in this book are how ordinary people become perpetrators of genocide, and why groups are targeted for mass killing, and how do groups justify these terrible acts. And in this chapter that I wrote together with my former PhD supervisor, Bernard Leitner, we focused on comparing the perspectives of what are commonly referred to as the victim and the perpetrator group in the aftermath of intergroup violence. The vast majority of social psychological work in the past has looked at either the victim perspective or the perpetrator perspective. But to fully understand violence and its aftermath requires a balanced account of both sides. So in this chapter, we draw on a wide range of theoretical and empirical work from psychology and political science. And today I will also share some of my own research in different conflict contexts. And before diving into this topic, I'd like to caution that although we classify people into victim and perpetrator groups in this chapter, these are not mutually exclusive social categories. In fact, even within the same conflict, groups can experience both victimization and perpetration. So it's crucial to keep in mind that these are not static or fixed categories. But victim and perpetrator identities are real and very relevant concepts to consider when trying to understand how individuals perceive, make sense of, and respond to intergroup violence. It probably doesn't surprise anyone in this audience that those who commit violence and those who suffer from it often live in completely different realities and have different understandings of what happened. And we're not just talking about the direct victims or perpetrators of violence, but also individuals who share the same group membership with the victims and perpetrators. Now let's take a moment to think about one of the most recent and darkest episodes of mass violence in human history, which is the Srebrenica massacre. What you see in this picture is the mass grave in Srebrenica, a small town in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1995, as part of the Bosnian War, over 7,000 Bosniaks living in this small town of Bosnia were systematically killed by the Serb forces. And this massacre was later recognized as a genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And despite the clear and seemingly indisputable records of the massacre, people in Serbia don't seem to agree with these records. Here on the left side, you can see the attitudes in Serbia towards the massacre. The polling is quite consistent over time, showing that while the majority of residents in Serbia had heard of the massacre, less than half of the population believed it actually happened, and even less people considered it a crime. And on the right side is a chart showing that only 10% of ethnic Serbs in Serbia accepted the facts regarding Srebrenica as they were established by the International Criminal Tribunal, which states that more than 7,000 Bosniaks were killed. And with the remaining of the population engaging in different types and different degrees of denial. And here's another graph showing how divided realities looked like in today's Bosnia, which consists of the Federation of Bosnia, where the residents are mostly Bosniaks, and the Republic Srpska, where the residents are mostly Serbs. And the y-axis of the graph shows some of the most serious crimes committed in the Bosnian War. And for each of the crimes, the top two bars show the share of respondents in the Federation of Bosnia who had heard of the event and believed it to be true. And in stark contrast, you can see the bottom two bars showing the share of respondents in the Republic of Srpska who had heard of the event and believed it to be true. For example, if we look at the third item, it says Sarajevo was under siege for 3 years and thousands of civilians were killed and wounded. And 90% of people in the Federation believed it to be true, whereas only a bit over 20% of people in Srpska acknowledged this historical fact. So the acknowledgement or outright denial of genocide is perhaps the most striking example of how victims and perpetrators can react differently to intergroup violence. But there are actually many other, perhaps more subtle ways in which victims and perpetrators differ in their responses to mass violence. First, let's consider how people perceive and make sense of intergroup violence. Do they see the violence as happening between individuals or between groups? Why did it happen, or what causes do they attribute the transgressions to? And how much harm was caused? And how do they view the past in relation to the present? To answer these questions, it's helpful to first understand that the most common and pressing motivation for victim and perpetrator groups after mass violence is to defend and protect their own group. And such a motivation often leads victims to view what happened through an intergroup lens and as deserving collective responses from the perpetrator group, such as official apologies issued by group leaders. But in contrast, the same defensive motivation often leads perpetrators to appraise their transgressions as between individuals rather than between groups. This way, these transgressions are less reflecting of the group's moral flaws. And similarly, victims also tend to make internal attributions about transgressions, such as attributing them to the evil nature of the perpetrator group, whereas perpetrators tend to attribute them to external factors, such as socioeconomic hardships. And compared to perpetrators, victims are also, they also tend to apply higher justice standards and perceive more harm. And they also tend to perceive the violent past as closer in time and more relevant to the present. And now I'll zoom in on the temporal asymmetry between the two groups, because that's also the focus of my own research. In the context of the Bosnian War, we conducted survey studies in Serbia and Bosnia. And one of the questions that we asked the respondents was how distant or close in time they felt the war in relation to the present. Here, I'm showing you the responses from Serbs and Bosniaks in our samples. And the Serbs, on average, perceived the war as significantly more distant in time compared to the Bosniaks. And this finding is in line with previous research on the use of temporal distancing as a way to morally disengage from atrocities committed by in-group members. And potentially victims perceive their past suffering as closer in time, also out of in-group protective motive, such that they can continue to pursue justice. And in addition to the asymmetrical perceptions of temporal distance, in the same research, we also looked at potential different implications of temporal distance for attitudes toward justice and reconciliation. Here, for Bosniaks, feeling temporally distant from their past suffering predicted more empathy toward the outgroup, which in turn led to less demand for punishment of Serb perpetrators, more support for pro-Serb policies, and more willingness to reconcile with Serbs. But in contrast, for Serbs, feeling temporally distant from their past transgressions predicted less empathy toward Bosniaks, which then in turn led to less approval of the punishment of in-group perpetrators, less support for pro-Bosniak policies, less positive attitudes towards the ICTY, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and less willingness to reconcile with Bosniaks. So these findings confirmed the morally disengaging functions of temporal distancing for perpetrator group members and potentially a healing function for victim groups. In addition to perceptions and appraisals of past violence, victims and perpetrators also tend to experience different emotions in the aftermath of intergroup violence. There's really a wide range of emotions, conflict-related emotions that people can experience. For instance, large-scale violence often creates a general climate of fear and anxiety for victims and survivors, which could be caused by perceived threats to the very existence of one's group. And for perpetrators, we have mainly discussed how they usually react defensively to the crimes committed by in-group members. But they are actually also capable of experiencing in-group critical moral emotions, such as guilt, shame, and regret. And all of these emotions can have different implications for conflict resolution and intergroup relations. And I won't go into details about every one of them, but I will talk a bit more about two specific emotions, anger and hate, because I think they are of particular interest to this audience. As we all know, anger and hate are both prevalent emotions in mass atrocities. They are often discussed as the emotional foundations of genocide, but victims can also experience anger and hate as a result of the extreme treatments they receive. And they can motivate revenge and support for future violence against perpetrators, which contributes to sustaining the cycle of violence. And we often talk about these two emotions interchangeably, but emotion researchers actually argue that anger and hate have very different properties. Anger and most of the other negative intergroup emotions have been shown to have both constructive and destructive effects on intergroup relations. But hate, on the other hand, seems to only lead to destructive outcomes. And this is for two main reasons. First of all, hate stems from the belief that the other group is immoral and evil in nature, and the belief that they are incapable of change. And second, hate triggers the specific goal of harming and even eliminating the hated group. Although hate is such a core emotion underlying genocide, it's actually very difficult to study empirically because people don't like to admit that they are capable of experiencing this emotion. So the empirical research on hate is actually very limited. And so far we have discussed victim and perpetrator groups as if they are homogeneous groups with little variation within each group. But the reality is that people actually disagree with each other within their respective group as much as they disagree with people from other groups. And to explain within group variations, one very useful concept to consider is in-group identification. For example, people would only experience group level emotions if they identify at least to some extent with their own group. And the more recent theorization of identification proposes that group identification is not a unidimensional concept, but rather has two main facets, attachment and glorification. Whereas attachment is generally thought to contribute to more positive intergroup outcomes, glorification has been consistently found to be a negative force in intergroup relations. And this is because attachment consists of emotional attachment to one's in-group and commitment to the group, whereas glorification consists of belief in in-group superiority over other groups and unconditional deference to in-group authorities, norms, and traditions. So in particular, there has been a lot of research showing that in-group glorification rather than attachment motivates in-group defensive appraisals and reactions to conflicts, such as the ones that I just described. Sorry, my screen is stuck. Okay. And in the same research that I shared with you earlier, we also found that the tendency to use temporal distancing as an in-group defensive or morally disengaging function was motivated by glorification, but not by attachment. And in a different study that we conducted in the US, we highlighted the perpetrator or victim role of the US in its conflict with Iran. And when the US was portrayed as the perpetrator, participants engaged in more temporal distancing. Participants engaged in more temporal distancing from the transgression. But in contrast, when the US was portrayed as the victim, glorification negatively predicted temporal distancing, showing that the in-group protective function of temporal distancing is likely motivated by in-group glorification. So I'll focus the last part of this presentation on how victims and perpetrators also differ in the ways in which they react to conflict interventions, including formal justice mechanisms and social psychological interventions. And I'll give one example of each type of intervention to illustrate that even well-intended interventions can have both constructive and destructive impact on victims and perpetrators. So now going back to the Yugoslav context, it probably won't surprise anyone now that Bosniaks and Serbs also held very different views of the ICTY and its functions in post-conflict reconciliation. And here on the right side of the graph, you can see that whereas the majority of Bosniaks, Muslim Bosniaks, saw the ICTY as contributing to the establishment of truth about what happened in the former Yugoslavia, only a minority of Serbs shared this belief. And here you can see that more than 70% of Serbs didn't think the ICTY contributed to reconciliation in the region, which stands in stark contrast with only more than 30% of Bosniaks rejected the conciliatory function of the court. So one straightforward explanation for these divergent responses to the criminal tribunal is that Serbs and Bosniaks simply had different understandings of what happened during the war. But there is an additional and probably equally plausible explanation, which is that victims and perpetrators have different understandings of what reconciliation means. And there is a really widely influential theory about how victims and perpetrators have different experiences after transgression. And this is the needs-based model of reconciliation. According to this model, victims and perpetrators have divergent psychological needs following a transgression. For victims, their sense of agency in terms of power, status, and control were severely deprived by their experience of victimization. And in contrast, the experience of perpetration poses a threat to people's moral image and identity. So victims' primary motivation after conflict is to restore their sense of agency or to empower themselves, whereas perpetrators' primary motivation is to repair their damaged moral image and to be reintegrated into the society. And victims and perpetrators would be more open to reconciliation if their respective need is satisfied. So in other words, reconciliation means empowerment for victims and social acceptance for perpetrators. So now thinking about the retributive justice measures that we just talked about, retributive justice imposes unilateral punishments against perpetrators. It can potentially empower victims and increase their sense of control and power. But at the same time, it poses even more threats to the moral image of perpetrators because it publicly denounces their wrongdoings. So even if both victims and perpetrators are on the same page about what happened, they may still desire different ways to address the past. And in the same intergroup context that I was talking about, we found that international tribunals can indeed increase willingness to reconcile among victims. And here I'm showing you the results of another study that we did in the context of the Bosnian War. And the results were replicated in the context of the conflict between the US and Iran. Here in these two studies, we experimentally manipulated whether the transgressions were addressed by a tribunal that punished perpetrators or the perpetrators were granted impunity. And here the graphs show that for victims, learning about a tribunal satisfied their demand for retributive justice and increased their willingness to reconcile. In a different context, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we found some evidence supporting the idea that perpetrators may be more open to restorative as compared to retributive justice. And we talked about their perpetrators and the victims' different needs after a conflict, because retributive justice is particularly threatening to perpetrators' needs for acceptance. It's possible that restorative justice, on the other hand, might be less threatening to them because it usually involves a bilateral process between victims and perpetrators. And it also emphasizes restoring the relations between groups affected by the conflict. So in this study, we give participants scenarios about Israeli aggression against Palestinian civilians. And then we manipulated whether the Palestinian Authority demanded apology and compensation or punishments of the Israeli perpetrators. And in the literature, apology and compensation are typical measures of restorative justice, whereas punishment is usually considered retributive. And then participants responded to these demands on a number of dimensions. Here, as expected, Israeli participants were less likely to accept the demand for punishment compared to the demand for apology and compensation. And compared to the victims' restorative demands, their demand for punishment reduced Israelis' trust in Palestinians. It increased dehumanization of Palestinians, and it also increased support for future violence. Even though in these two studies that I just showed you, we didn't directly compare victims and perpetrators' reactions to conflicts, the message is quite clear that they may have different preferences for justice, depending on the focus of the justice, whether it's more retributive or restorative. So finally, I'd like to touch upon how victims and perpetrators can also have differential reactions to social psychological interventions. For example, I'll focus on intergroup contact because it's one of the most widely studied and applied psychological intervention in conflicts. It has been shown in numerous studies that positive contacts between group members can reduce prejudice and promote intergroup harmony by, for example, enhancing the knowledge of the other group, lowering intergroup anxiety, and increasing empathy towards the other group. But there has been a recent shift from focusing on prejudice reduction as the outcome of intergroup conflict to a focus on structural changes that promote social justice and equality. And recent research has shown that intergroup contact may actually be destructive to promote positive social change because it reduces collective action intentions among victims. For perpetrators or advantaged group members, positive contact is actually very beneficial for both goals. It increases their support for social change because positive contact increases perceived illegitimacy of group differences, increases the satisfaction of needs for acceptance, and increases perpetrators' identification with the disadvantaged group. But in contrast, positive contact between group members actually reduces victims' perceived illegitimacy of group differences. It lowers their need for empowerment, and it increases focus on a superordinate identity that includes the perpetrator group. And all of these mechanisms actually reduces victims' support for social change. So what does this all mean for conflict resolution and reconciliation? All these differential perceptions, appraisals, and responses to intergroup conflicts actually present one of the most challenging obstacles to conflict resolution. Interventions that successfully address one group's needs and concerns are often perceived as very threatening to the other group. And interventions focusing on improving intergroup attitudes without addressing the differences between groups may not contribute to sustainable peace in the long run. So interventions can potentially benefit from considering both victims and perpetrators' perspectives, and also from addressing the diverse goals related to conflict societies, especially the goals that go beyond improving intergroup attitudes and emotions. And there are actually also many remaining questions to be explored for researchers and academics. So I'll just focus on two examples here. One is the multitude of factors influencing the asymmetries between victims and perpetrators. And that we've talked about the differential psychological needs and identity concerns among victims and perpetrators, and also how different facets of group identification can influence appraisals and responses to conflicts. Another very important and powerful factor is collective narratives, which are often transmitted across generations and shape how people interpret, make sense of, and respond to conflicts. And this is especially important to consider when we try to understand those who are not directly affected by the violence, because their indirect experiences and perceptions are primarily shaped by the societies that they grew up in. And I have mentioned briefly at the beginning that conflicts characterized by a very clear distinction between victim and perpetrator groups are actually very rare. So it will be very important for future research to try to understand the psychological experiences that of groups that played both victim and perpetrator roles in conflicts. Right. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that wonderful and educational walk through a very complex set of material and educating us all on that. I will start with some of the questions that are already populated in. I have some more of my own, but I encourage people to keep adding to the questions. And we'll again stop at the top of the hour. So the first question is, were the perpetrators people who actually committed violence, or were they just members of the perpetrator group?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So in the research that I've been sharing with you, the perpetrators are mostly members of the perpetrator group, but not the individuals who actively committed violence themselves. So they share the same group membership.
Great. And the second question is, how does all this, I guess, it's a large question, but how does this apply to the divisions in the United States?
Sorry, how does this
apply your overview of how people see themselves as victors, victims and perpetrators and so forth. How does it apply to the current divisions in the United States, if it does?
Yes, so it is indeed a very complex question. I think, of course, we need to be more specific about the divisions we're talking about. I think one thing to consider is whether the different groups in the US consider themselves as the victims or the perpetrators. I think maybe the framework is more relevant to conflicts where there is a more clear distinction between these two identities. And because one important dimension of victim and perpetrator identity is the power differential. So it can definitely be applied to, for example, the racial inequality in the US and conflicts between immigrants and the racial majority. Because there is also a clear power differential between these groups. But I think if we're talking about political divisions, the framework might be less applicable because they are not really clearly victim or perpetrator groups. So I think to answer this question, we need to consider the exact divisions that we're talking about.
Great. And let me follow up on that because I found that a very interesting question too. So you're right in the sense that you don't have the parallel to what you study in terms of actual violence and people's perception of that and time, distance away from it and how they think about it. But there is a comparison. I mean, I spend a lot of time watching all different sorts of media from right wing to, progressive. And part of the narrative, it really is seeing we're being noble, we're protecting ourselves. It's these other folks on the other side of the political divide that are trying to take away our rights or try to take away our ability. So there is some parallel there. So is there, from your research, even though it's looking at violence, are there principles as we're watching the political divide in the United States that would be helpful for us to unpack what's going on?
Yes, I think there is some parallel because as you were saying, the identity is a very subjective perception and experience. So for people who do actually perceive some of their, for example, their resources being taken away or their groups being victimized in one way or another, I think some of the things that I've discussed are indeed applicable. So it really depends on the subjective experiences and perceptions of the groups. So I think it's, in terms of the collective narrative, I think it's very true that both political parties often portray themselves, maybe not as a typical victim in the sense that we often hear about in large-scale violence, but there is a strong sense of injustice on both sides, and I think in that sense, they do consider them as victimized in some ways. And I think the framework can apply in this way.
Great, thank you. And to sort of follow up on that, in your research, where do conspiracy theories play in this? Because again, the reality back to the United States, I mean, one of the things that's disturbing at this moment is how many people believe, for example, that the 2020 election was stolen, and believe that, and believe the conspiracies around. I mean, that's not just like fringe stuff where we had the militia groups that were talking, conspiracy theories back in the 90s. This is like, millions of people. So is there, something, as we're seeing conspiracy theories play out in this political conflict, is there something from your research on violence that ties into how people try to reduce things into these simple, black and white, and the other side is conspiring to harm us? That would be instructive.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't looked at conspiracy theories myself, but it does fit into the bigger idea of collective narratives in the aftermath of conflicts. So people really try to come up with all sorts of narratives to make sense of what happened. And one way to make sense of what happened is to come up with conspiracy theories and actually believe in them. So in that sense, I think there is a very strong parallel between having these conspiracy theories and coming up with different conflict narratives in large-scale violence. So it is a way that people use to defend their own group and to come up with a version of the what happened that makes them feel safe and secure, and instead of being threatened by what happened.
Great, thank you. So the next question, and people feel free to add more, is it strikes me that the dual victim perpetrator identity is essentially the case of, quote, being a human being. We hurt and we are hurt. Can you share several potential hypotheses you might have about the case of dual victim perpetrator identity?
Sure, that's something that I've been thinking a lot about because this is actually a more accurate description of actual large-scale conflicts that people do perceive both kinds of roles of their group. But so maybe I first share some of the existing research that has looked into this question. There is some research showing that people who feel both victim and the perpetrator, they actually do have the need for both empowerment and for acceptance. So they kind of embrace the identities of both roles. But on the other hand, when it comes to actual behavior, actually their behavior is more driven by their sense of victimhood. So it seems that victimhood can take primacy when it comes to motivating behavior. But this is one of the very few empirical work on this question. So there really is a lot to be done to address the dual identity question. And I think another really important question in this direction is if they feel the threat from both identities, do they also do they also perceive the resources from both identities? Because being a victim means that they are more morally maybe not superior, but they have the moral standing in the conflict. And then being a perpetrator, they have more agency and more control over their behavior. So these two are potentially resources that people can perceive in coping with violence. So it's still unclear whether people with dual identities can actually perceive more resources as they perceive more threats.
So that's fascinating. And sort of a follow-up to that, assuming people have these multiple identities, are there things that more likely to drive them to, to one bucket or the other? I mean, what's in the media, what their, religious groups, I mean, what are the things that may make them tend towards one aspect of the identity versus the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would probably go back to collective narratives, because that's really a powerful driving force in post-conflict societies. I think when people try to make sense of or decide what to do with the conflict, they often look at what the society says, what the group leaders say. So that's one force that would shape whether people end up feeling more victim or feeling more perpetrator. If the group leader, for example, actively embrace their perpetratorhood and apologize for the past wrongdoings, then I think that's likely to move the group members to also acknowledge their perpetrator identity, because it's much easier to embrace a victim identity than to embrace a perpetrator identity. Yeah, but of course there are a lot of factors that play into which identity might become more salient. It could also be situationally activated, depending on whether there is an active threat. For example, if they get into a conflict with other groups, then perhaps the victim identities really get activated. Yeah, so those are some potential
Great. Thank you.
factors.
And one follow-up on that is, but doesn't one become a perpetrator out of a feeling of victimhood?
Does one become a perpetrator
Out of a
out of,
feeling of victimhood?
can you elaborate on the question?
Well, that's just what somebody. I guess
Okay.
what I guess the question comes into what drives somebody to be a perpetrator. Could it be partly
Um,
because they believe that somehow they've been, disrespected and dismissed and see themselves as a victim, therefore justifying what they're going to do to perpetrate things?
Yes, absolutely. So then I think we're talking about the cycle of violence where victims often become perpetrators in future conflicts. And that's very common. And actually, that's also a main focus of my research, to look at the cycles of violence. And I've found in different conflict contexts where victims, once they are reminded of their past victimhood, they are more supportive of violence against the perpetrator group and even against unrelated third parties. If they embrace some kind of exclusive sense of victimhood or perpetual sense of victimhood, that their group is constantly victimized throughout history and the whole world is hostile to their group. So these kind of victim beliefs are very motivating of violence, hostility towards other groups. But there are also very inclusive victim beliefs. I just want to mention that. So you, in contrast to competitive, exclusive victimhood, people sometimes construe their victimhood as inclusive of other groups, that other groups have also suffered similarly to their groups. So these kind of victim beliefs are actually very inducive of pro-social outcomes and very constructive responses to conflicts.
This I'm just going to add in as just maybe an outlier, but it struck me as of interest. I spoke a few years ago to a sociologist who was doing some work in Rwanda, and again, it may be an outlier, but she interviewed people that were in prison, some of whom were both. They were perpetrators one day, and then they were standing up and protecting people the next day. So, they were in both. Is there any sort of understanding of how somebody could be in those two different roles, in a very short period of time?
Yeah, so you were talking about people who are perpetrators and also
Protected, went out of their way, endangered themselves to protect
right.
other victims on a different day.
Yeah, I think that's probably very rare. So you're talking about people who do both to the same group of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very intriguing case, I would say,
Yeah.
because usually in those kind of mass violence, perpetrators, because once they have engaged in violence against one group of people, they have come up with all sorts of justifications for their actions, and those justifications really trap them in this mindset that the victim group deserve to be harmed or even eliminated. So it's a really intriguing case that the same perpetrator can also become the helpers for the same victim group. But I don't know about the exact circumstances, but I guess I would speculate that those perpetrators are not really ideologically committed to the conflict, and they might be more strategic in their actions. But it's completely speculative.
No, I appreciate that. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but if you're interested, I'll connect you later with the person who
Yeah.
did those interviews. So a couple more questions, and I have a couple more if we have time to. Is identification or desire to be part of the European project in the former Yugoslavia, does it influence perpetrators' interest in reconciliation?
Sorry, can you see the
So
last?
I guess the question is, is a desire to be part of Europe, does that influence the perpetrator's interest in reconciliation? In other words, are there political goals that can change how people perceive what they want to see in reconciliation?
Yes, absolutely. So the same polling results that I showed you as part of the same survey, they also asked about their attitudes. There were a lot more questions about Serbs' attitudes toward the war crimes, and one of the results was that they are very interested in joining the EU, and because of that, they are also more supportive of the ICTY and criminal processes. So I think in Serbia, there is a prevalent sentiment that they would be interested in addressing their past if there is some clear material incentive for them to do so.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, the narrative in Nazi Germany was that Germans were victimized by the demands of World War I, and that victim narrative provided a foundation and motivation for becoming the perpetrators, victim and perpetrator roles reinforcing each other?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's really the reality of a lot of conflicts. So if we are talking about the origins and the roots of conflicts, they often stem from this feeling of relative deprivation, injustice, and feelings of victimization by other groups or external factors, socioeconomic conditions. Yeah, so these are often the roots of intergroup conflicts. And then you have genocide and mass atrocities, which then creates new perpetrators and new victims.
And let me ask a couple of my questions. So I was taken by the fact that you defined hate as an emotion, which it clearly is, but I'm thinking that it's also an attitude, it's a behavior. And I'm wondering about, how you see it as part of an ideology, because even if people, are not feeling a strong visceral emotion of hatred, if it's a way of thinking about other groups or other people, other nations, depending on whatever divisions you want to do, as sort of us and a them, and they're less human. They may be, people that you want to demonize and dehumanize. How does it work not only as an emotion but as an ideological anchor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in conceptualizing hate, I was really speaking from the psychological literature. So it has a rather narrow definition of what hate means. But of course, hate is understood as a kind of emotion. But as you were saying, it can also be closely associated with behaviors, motivations, and ideologies. So when people try to understand extremism or terrorism, hate is often one of the talked about as one of the core foundations of such ideology. Um, so it, from a psychological perspective, it's still an intergroup emotion, but it can be a core element of ideology. So you can have extremist ideology that really predicates on hate against a group of people. Mm, but the ideology is much broader than this emotion.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And we'll have more conversations about that, I'm sure. So, so let me ask you, because we only have a couple of minutes left. You mentioned the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I remember reading something, oh, maybe in a paper about from 20 years ago or so, that struck me, that basically said that the one thing that got people to think of ways of reconciling was that each side basically had to see the other lose. They had to lose one of their sacred values. If they saw the other side lose one of their, their sacred values or core principles, and being willing to move forward, that was the time that they themselves were willing to go and take the next step, which is one of the things that, I was thinking about back when the, Kushner and the Trump administration was basically saying, oh, we're going to get the Palestinians really happy if we give them a lot of money. And it seems to me that that idea that, this is about values, this is about narratives, this is about identity, that type of prescription suggests that people are willing to be bought off. And it seems to me that this is much deeper. This is wanting to see the other side give up something in order for you to step forward. So I wonder what your reaction to that is.
Yeah, I think that's really a typical example of a conflict intervention that targets one side, but actually backfires for the other side. Um, it can probably be seen as something it's satisfying for the Israelis, for example, but for the Palestinians receiving this kind of intervention, it can feel very insulting, and vice versa. If you want the other side to give up something really valuable to them, so it's, I guess I wouldn't call it a step towards resolution or reconciliation, because it really only addresses the psychological needs of one side of the conflict. Yeah, but this is a common problem in conflict interventions, because usually the intervention focuses on addressing the needs of one side, but it can actually be very threatening for the other side.
Thank you. And then final question, and then I'll let you go because I know it's late for you and you have a young child and all those things. So I really appreciate the time. So we're all watching what may be a catastrophe in Ukraine and Russia and Europe in general unfold in real time. So, given what you know, and as you're watching this, what are the things that you think for us who don't have your expertise? What are the things that we should be looking for to understand more completely what's developing in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question. I don't think I can offer anything unique, but I think it's a very typical, maybe textbook example of how conflict spiral develops, and how the lack of trust in each side can really make both sides more hostile, even if perhaps the real threat is not as great as what both sides perceive it to be. Um, yeah, but it's a super complex situation, and I'm also trying to learn about it myself. So I don't want to
That's fine.
offer any insights that might be wrong later, but I think indeed, I think it really fits with the psychological account of how conflicts how conflict escalates, and yeah, maybe looking at the history, you can see that these conflicts can indeed be resolved without going into wars. But yeah.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you again for your time. And I appreciate, the audience and I being here and listening to you. We're going to put this up on the center's YouTube channel tomorrow, so a lot more people will see it. And I really look forward to the day post-COVID, we'll get you back to BARD in person. I think I know there are students on this webinar today, but I think, having conversations with students who are where you were 10 years ago would be a great asset. And I'm sure they'd love to meet you. And anyway, so we'll make that happen as soon as we can. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Okay. Thank
having
you.
me, and thank you for all the fantastic questions and discussions.
Great. Thank you. And you have a good evening, and goodbye, everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.